And the book, in any case, is a kind of collection of essays on fairly disparate topics to do with different aspects of the Muslim presence in Western Europe, trying to look at it from a theological rather than a sociological optic. I suppose if there's anything new about it, it's that it looks at what it means religiously, or what it might mean religiously for a continent that historically has defined itself as not being Muslim, to have Muslims now as its largest and in many cases most controversial minority. It's one of the ironies, antinomies of our time, that we are in this strange situation. How does one become a European Muslim in a way that is faithful to the religious narrative when Europeanness has historically defined itself as being not Saracenic, not Turkish, not Mongol, whatever it might be? The definition of Europe really is not geographical so much as cultural, and the legacy of what used to be called Christendom. So this is a different problematic of integration than that which, say, American Muslims or Canadian, Australian, South African Muslims find themselves confronted with. And in many ways, it is more problematic. And the antibodies that are now appearing in order to cluster around us and change us or drive us out are more numerous, by and large, than in other places of the modern Muslim migration. So what I want to do is not to summarize the book for you, but rather to pick up on a few issues that probably I didn't deal with enough in the book. It turns out to be such an enormous and actually fascinating topic, the intersection of so many narratives and, of course, regional variations, because Europe, like Islam, is not a single thing, but has internal differentiations. But to take a step back instead and to try and look at the big picture, the meta-narrative. What does Islam take itself to be? What does Europe take itself to be? And what historically has been the nature of that engagement, and what might be a Sharia-compliant way of turning that engagement into something that helps everybody to relax rather than to feel constantly on edge. So to take the biggest possible step back, I suppose we go back to the origins of the religion, where the word Europe was probably not known at all, but where we do get in the Hijra moment a sense that this is to be a religion of migration and of transformation, but also in a strange way of inclusion and the overcoming of existing cultural and ethnic and tribal barriers. That might be one way of beginning the whole discussion of what it is to be a Muslim migrating, with the Holy Prophet as the sort of preeminent muhajir. Well, we note that the first thing that he did, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he completes his hijrah, his immigration as an asylum seeker, I guess, refugee, those terms do work, in the city of Medina, was to create his mosque. And we're all familiar with the famous story of how he let his camel, good politics there, choose the site for the mosque. And the reason for that is that he didn't want to be seen to be favoring any of the existing ethnicities. The hadith, sound hadith, explains how representatives of the different tribes come to him while he's sitting on the camel with the reins loose, just letting the camel do the deciding as to where he's going to get down, build his house, build his mosque, and everybody is following to see where he's going to end up. And each tribe sends a representative saying, come to us, come to this tribe, we've got more suits of armor, we're more numerous, we can keep you safe, and so forth. But instead, the place that the camel or divine providence chooses is a kind of nowhere, the famous mirbad, the date drying yard that belongs to two orphans. So they're effectively outside the tribal system, and this place is a kind of nothing. And it's in that place that he descends, and that's now the site, of course, of the Haram Nabawi, which is said to be the second largest building in the world. The first, I think, is the Boeing factory in Seattle. So that's been the trajectory. But Even more interesting than that, it becomes the first non-ethnic place that Arabia has really ever known, because the mosque of the Holy Prophet والسلام, is a jami', which means inclusive. I like the way in which the word for a place of worship in our religion means inclusive, literally. So not only are all of the tribes there equal in, it doesn't matter which tribe they belong to, and this is a completely new experience for the Arabs of Arabia and must have blown their minds. But also you get Bilal, the Abyssinian, you get Sohaib, the Byzantine, you get Salman, the Persian, and others. And that's a kind of anticipation of what nowadays we would call, probably in this trite, secular, flat way, multiculturalism. But reality, because they actually have a purpose. They're facing a qibla. They're not just milling around with various rights and duties, being citizens and consumers. They have a qibla, they have a direction. Now, the message that is being presaged by that is no less than the third replenishment of monotheism. And the Quran, again in this inclusive mode, has so much to say that's positive about the great figures of the two immediately precedent monotheisms. Even in its beginning, the Quran is encompassing the world. وَلِكُلِّ قَوْمٍ هَادٍ. For every people there has been a guide. وَإِن مِّنْ أُمَّةٍ إِلَّا خَلَا فِيهَا نَذِيرٌ. There has never been a people amongst whom a divine warner has not passed. So implicitly everybody, all of the descendants of Adam and Hawa, alayhim as-salam, have been touched by truth. It's another sign of Islam's inclusivity, and that wherever the believer goes, he is going to God's place and therefore to his place. And so we find hadiths such as one of his khasa'is, one of his special features, which is not shared by any earlier prophet, is وَجُعِلَتْ لِيَ الْأَرْضُ مَسْجِدًا. The whole earth has been made a prostration place for me, which means that Muslims never really travel abroad. They're going from one place that is a place that belongs to the Muslims to another place that belongs to the Muslims, even though the nature of that belongingness might be politically, socially, economically really different. But it's still al-ardu ardullah. The land is Allah's land, which is sometimes why we exaggerate when we say the Islamic world and the non-Islamic world. Well, the world is God's world, therefore the world is all Islamic. And Muslims, as they have expanded in this extraordinary kind of big bang, whereby the Sahaba spread over so much of the world, have always been aware of this, that they belong everywhere. We are not really a diaspora. We are the ones who most belong. We are the ones who press our foreheads to the ground. We are the ones who see Allah's signs around us. It's our place wherever we go. And this comes, as I said, as the third replenishment, not as something that wipes out everything and comes tabula rasa with a negation of everybody else's story, but rather as a reparation of the earlier stories, and also, as the Quran says, as a protection for them. وَمُهَيْمِنًا عَلَيْهِ. And that becomes evident in Islam's tradition of maintaining stable, multi-religious as well as multi-ethnic societies. Necessarily, there were certain rights and obligations which were different for different communities. It wasn't a kind of Enlightenment egalitarian thing, as if these religious differences just didn't matter. But it was a protection which enabled minorities to be more sure about the continuation of their narrative than is possible for minorities in the modern West, for instance. They would have their own law courts, they would have their own institutions, their own community, their own millah. So they could be sure, pretty sure, that their great-grandchildren would be following their way, which is not the case for minorities in the modern West, where everything is in the blender of globalization and confusion and assimilation. So this new message, which affirmed those anbiya, those prophets, and affirmed the messianic moment, then spread in this miraculous and extraordinary way, usually, according to historians, because the local populations kind of wanted it to happen, especially minorities who'd been oppressed, particularly those who'd been oppressed by Zoroastrian landowners or who had been oppressed because they were Jews by the Christians, or because they were Monophysites by the great church. But the story of the conquest is the story of local collaborations. Muslims entered Spain at the invitation, it seems, of the Jewish community, etc. So not really conquest in the traditional sense, the way, say, Napoleon conquered or the Mongols conquered. This is different and unusual. So they reach all of these places, and basically the Roman Empire becomes theirs. Africa, Asia, they're at the gates of China, they're through the Caucasus, but the last little top left-hand corner of Christendom is not included in this new ecumenical world. That's the bit that doesn't get included, and it's pretty small. It's maybe 5% of the size of the Ummah at the time of the Abbasids, for instance. It's pretty small. If you go to a village called Moussy-la-Bataille, which is in central France, there's a big diorama and information plaques and things explaining the history of the battle that took place there. Maybe the biggest battle in European history. Bigger than Stalingrad, Dunkirk, maybe, I don't know. This is when the Spanish Muslims, most of them converts, remember Tariq bin Ziyad himself seems to have been convert, under Abdurrahman al-Ghafiqi, flooded over the Pyrenees, went halfway through France, and it looked as if the last little bit, the last little excrescence was going to enter this new enormous, prosperous world, this community of the Ummah. But at that battle, they failed. And you can see all kinds of graffiti there. Never again type. It's a symbol now for the far right in France of keep the Arabs out. We almost, very nearly, all of Europe became Muslim. And if you were to look at a GPS tracking a line over land from Medina to KCL, you'd probably find that the Muslims had traveled about 94% of that distance. There's only a little bit left. But in any case, there are regions that become margins of Europe that become enormously important in the European imagination, no less than the Crusades. The great stories of Europe are the stories of the chanson de geste, the Crusader struggle against the Saracen and against the East. Sometimes it's racialized, sometimes not. So in Spain, you have the extraordinary and, for us, excruciating story of the Reconquista and the Inquisition. It was really difficult to re-establish Christianity in Spain. Tariq had conquered it in just a few years. It was an easy conquest, as the historians narrate. It took 800 years for the Crusaders to get it back again with the most extraordinary episodes of ethnic cleansing and the complete destruction, not just of Muslim communities, but of Jewish communities as well. A very appalling story if you read about what that entailed. And despite that, there were still people, and this is part of the unsung heroic story of us as European Muslims, which is the Elches. We deserve to remember them. And Elche was somebody who converted to Islam from Christianity in Spain after the Reconquista. In other words, after the Muslims had been defeated and the Christians were ruling, and to practice Islam could lead to your being burnt at the stake with your family and your children forcibly adopted by nuns and brought up as Catholics. It was very absolute. That despite the fear of that, there were still people converting to Islam, and these are the Elches. So Europe always knew that it was unacceptable, only be defeated with extreme violence. The same, in a way, can be said about the other margins. Southern Italy, the story of the destruction of Islam in Sicily, which has left its mark on so much Sicilian and Southern Italian folklore. The great world of Aghlabid Sicily, which was a place of conviviality between religions. Under Roger and some of the Norman kings, they tried to keep that going, but the church wouldn't have it. And Frederick, the emperor, was excommunicated because he was hanging out with Muslims. Again, it was an absolute story of not a single Muslim can be allowed to remain on this continent. The Balkans, of course, an unfinished story. And we saw, in a sense, a kind of latter-day re-emergence of the crusading principle and the ethnic cleansing with Bosnia only a quarter of a century ago. Europe was kind of baffled by the extremity of the violence. Rape camps, mass murder of children, crucifixions, impalement, people having crosses carved on their chest in camps. It was extraordinary, medieval indeed. And the Serbian church has still not apologized. And there's a chapter on Bosnia in my book, if you could stomach it. It's not a pretty story. Further to the east, the great story of the Muslims of the Volga. Islam reached Russia before Christianity reached Russia. I was in Russia a few years ago, and it's interesting that Europe's biggest Muslim, it's not an immigrant community. In fact, they say we were here before the Christians were. Very different dynamic. There's 1 million Muslims in Moscow now. It's a vast, successful community. But then you look at how Ivan the Terrible exterminated the population of Kazan, tore down the great mosque of Kul Sharif in order to build St. Basil's in Moscow, the prohibition on any non-Trinitarian religion for 300 years on pain of death. And that continues even in the 19th century. The big story of Islam in Europe in the 19th century is the Circassian genocide. A big, successful, well-loved country, part of the Ummah, that had been Muslim for 600 years, 90% of the population is destroyed in the 19th century. And you remember when they had the Sochi Olympics, whenever it was, 2012, was it 2014? Muslims around the world were saying, you can't build the stadium there. That's where the Shuhada are buried. And in the West, they didn't know what Circassia was or what that massacre was. The biggest massacre in Europe in the 19th century, it's not really part of their consciousness. They really don't understand. Boris Johnson's great-grandfather was a Circassian Hafiz. Again, the journalists scratch their heads. They don't even know what or where Circassia was. So the countries can be completely eliminated. So all around Europe, this continent, where we've now made our home, we have these quite excruciating stories in which Europe is trying to keep out the third replenishment. It's always been tough to the Jewish minorities, who always found it more comfortable in the world of Islam, the existence of the Azan, and it pushed it out with these extraordinary, terrible acts of violence. In any case, so that's kind of the prehistory, and it's a little bit depressing, it has to be said. Not a good precedent, and it's different for Muslims in America, Canada, where the local story really is of the white man exterminating native populations. And it's a very different dynamic. But in any case, this is our situation. So despite this, we have, and again, this is something I didn't really talk about enough in the book, what I might describe as the 3 waves of love. Now that sounds terribly soppy. This kind of monastic, flagellant, celibate religion, and again, the part of the generosity of the Quran is that it doesn't condemn the Christian invention of monasticism, but they didn't uphold it correctly. Quite right. Look at the recent scandals in the Catholic Church, and you can see the Quran has hit a bullseye. But that kind of very grim view, original sin, every baby is born damned, that Augustinian world of severity that on the one hand says we like the Gospels, but on the other hand is as ungospel as you can imagine in the Knights Templars, the Knights Hospitallers, the Knights of Calatrava. It's pride in its crusading chivalric prowess, that extraordinary contradiction. Is influenced, of course, by the superior, larger civilization of Islam, which is all around it. And you might have seen Diana Dark's recent book, came out just last year, Stealing from the Saracens. Something a lot of Europeans don't want to acknowledge. But if you look around King's College, and maybe not the kind of Romanesque bits in the chapel, but the more Gothic bits, or you go over the road and look at the Inns of Court, Lincoln's Inn, and all of that kind of 19th century Gothic revival, where does that come from? Stolen from the Saracens. The most characteristic features of English monumental architecture were brought back from the Middle East by the Crusaders. And the whole book is about that. Even the rose windows, it seems, are a Umayyad invention. I didn't know that, but she's tracked it down. Why did Christopher Wren, not so far from you, just down the road, when he built St. Paul's, build it in a Romanesque rather than a Gothic style? He said, the Gothic style, that's the Saracen style, that's the Muslim style. People recognize this. So we have these waves of influence from the superior civilization. And we have, and this tends to be the thing that we over-egg, scientific innovations, Islamic water clocks, the compass, algebra, and all of that scientific stuff that we want to present as being our key contribution to European culture. Yeah, okay, those things were part of Islam and came into Europe, and philosophy was changed, and medicine was certainly changed. The Muslims invented the hospital, and the Europeans picked up on it. All of those things are known. But what's significant is that which lies nearer to the heart of the human condition, which is its orientation towards God and the world. How did the Muslims transform this? Well, we don't have much time, but let's go through these three waves of love. Contexts where, despite the Iron Curtain that the church had erected to keep out the evil Saracens, nevertheless managed to percolate through those barriers and try and in order to give people a more hopeful, a more loving, a more upbeat view of their relationship to their creator, the creator's purposes, and how to deal with each other. First of these comes pretty early with the troubadours. It's generally accepted now that the word troubadour is of Arabic origin. And the troubadours are influenced by Muslims from Spain and the general Islamic upbeat kind of relaxed Arabic culture of Spain. And they're singing of love. The nasib of the ancient Arabic qasida is transformed into the ghazal, which becomes the muwashshahat, the strophic poetry of Al-Andalus, and then through these lute strumming minstrels goes all over southern Europe with the idea of courtly love. Al-Hubb al-Udri, as the Arabs used to say. Generally, we recognize that that tradition of chivalric love, Arthur and Guinevere and so forth, that is of Islamic origin because it doesn't have any precedent and certainly isn't validated by the Augustinian churches of the time, which were very much in favor of the religious elite being celibate. You can talk more about that. The origins of the Grail legend, for instance. Generally, historians acknowledge that Wolfram von Eschenbach, who was the first significant contributor of a Grail legend in medieval Germany, and on the basis of whose Grail story, Parsifal, Wagner wrote his last and greatest opera. Wolfram says, well, I got this from a guy who heard it from some Arabs in Saragossa when we were in Spain. And actually the Grail is a stone that fell to earth. And so historians nowadays, and you can even see it in Roger Scruton's book, came out just last year, just before he died, on Parsifal, that actually the Grail that Europeans have been scratching around looking for so long is actually the black stone in Mecca. That's a very respectable view amongst historians. So again, we get this sense that Europe is looking for the truth of the third replenishment, desperate for it, chafing under the Augustinianism of Western Christianity. Eastern Christianity is actually quite different on these things, but Western Christianity. And this Grail legend represents perhaps a rather sad European attempt to look for where the Grail really is. The real Grail temple, of course, is the Haram in Mecca, where you can actually see the Holy Grail, which is the black stone. So more could be said about that, but time is short. Second wave of love comes with Goethe and Schiller and the whole Romantic movement following the Enlightenment. And this has been documented quite well by my former student, Jeff Einboden, in his book, Islam and Romanticism, which talks about the transformative effect of the translation of Sufi, usually Persian, but sometimes Turkish poetry into Enlightenment Europe by people like von Hammer, some of the French translators, and in England, Pocock and so forth. And this gives people a vision of a different kind of religion, something that is based not on flagellation and a cosmic sacrifice, but is based on love, turning back to God, who is Al-Habib, Al-Wadud, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. And he is of such mercy that he will accept that, and seeing the lovability of others. This is the Sufi idea of the Shahid, witnessing the divine in others, human beings as reflecting something of the divine glory. So that's wave number 2. And in this country, you can see a later representation of it, perhaps through the great Victorian phenomenon of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which had a big effect changing people's sensibilities, even though it's a very odd and hedonistic type of rendering. So the third wave is underway right now, which is, I suppose, the Rumi phenomenon, which a number of authors like Franklin Lewis have discussed. How is it that the most popular poet now, even in the United States, is not an American or a Christian or an atheist, but Jalaluddin Rumi? Great irony that despite the Muslim ban, the war on terror, Islamophobia, etc., America's favorite poet happens to be a mosque preacher from 13th century Afghanistan, who ends up in what's now Turkey. They don't really know that, but so great is the power of this irresistible Islamic discourse of turning back to God in love and finding him to be the Tawwab. This discourse of seeing the beauty in creation, a very upbeat type of religion, that the Americans can't get enough of it. So that's, in parenthesis, the 3 waves of love, which I think are much more significant as examples of how Islam, in its essence, hasn't really successfully been kept out of our continent, despite the sort of grim, beetling brows of the Crusaders guarding the frontiers. Then moving on a bit, and just to talk about something else that isn't in the book, this might seem like a rather strange way of presenting it, but the story of Europeans who, once conversion to Islam becomes legal again, and it wasn't for most of this history. Remember the first British Muslim martyrs in the early 17th century were 3 Welshmen who were actually found out to be Muslims, refused to be baptized again, and were killed by being impaled on stakes. The early British Muslim martyrs, the Laudian Inquisition. You can read about it in Nabil Matar's book on Islam in Elizabethan and early Georgian England. But then with the decline of the traditional theocratic values of Europe, the appearance of the Enlightenment, you have a lineage, well, a number of lineages, because the story of Europe's reception of Islam, its awakening to the third replenishment is very complicated. Nobody's really mapped it out properly. But probably the most conspicuous writer who's really opened the floodgates was René Guénon, Shaykh Abdal Hakim Murad, who dies in 1951. Strange, idiosyncratic person in many ways, a religious pluralist, perennialist, and personally that's not my cup of tea. But one can set that aside and see the enormous impact that his books such as Crisis of the Modern World, The Reign of Quantity have had on subsequent European Muslim understandings of what it is to be Muslim in Europe. And particularly Guénon's conviction that the most suitable religion for modern Europeans is actually Islam. That's quite a big thing for him to say, given that he's probably France's best-selling ever writer on religion and comparative religion. His books are still endlessly being reprinted, and they've gone into lots of other languages. Why does he say this? He says, because it is intact. In other words, in its forms, in its basic doctrines, and also for him, in its initiatic capacity, it is still available. And therefore, it is more appropriate that Europeans should enter Islam than that they should try and revive what he saw as a decadent and modernized Catholicism, or he didn't really have any respect for the Protestant churches, which he saw as just simple, flat fundamentalisms. So Guénot's disciple, Mustafa Valsan, who dies in 1974, Sheikh Mustafa Abdul Aziz, continues this work, and then Charles-André Gillis, who is maybe Valsan's leading disciple, who's, alhamdulillah, he's old now, but is still alive. One of the most sort of significant writers for intelligent French Muslims. He has an amazing book on the Hajj and the significance of the Haram in Mecca, which I was looking at just the other day. But his significance for this is that I've taken his theology of Muslims in Europe as the kind of starting point for my book. Lots of books about Muslim demography in Europe, migration patterns, problems of integration, Islamophobia. The shelves are groaning with those things. Some of them are quite good. Those are all legitimate things to write about. But has it been written about from the point of view of this big story of Europe's largest minority now being that which represents Europe's historic dark other, the folk devil, the Saracen, the terrible Turk? And what is the divine purpose in this? So Charles-André Gillis, in what's quite a short book, begins, I think, this process of meditation, and I found it really very helpful, in that he sees it as a kind of lifebelt thrown to a drowning Europe by a heaven that is giving it one final chance. Now, this is the inversion of the usual discourse, which is that these are sort of migrant communities that need to shape up and that sometimes produce terrorists or criminals, and they're just a nuisance and they need to become like us if they're to be enlightened. He's doing it the other way around and saying the presence of Turks in Germany, Moroccans in France, Mirpuris in England, and so forth, is actually heaven's way of giving Europe a final chance of recovering its sense of divine orientation. It's not going to be Christendom again, but it can still relate to God. And following Guénot and his idea that because Islam is intact in its practices and not being modernized in ways that make it flat and kind of just modern and therefore not particularly new or challenging, has a particular role to play. So that's the kind of intellectual genealogy of the book, I guess. And then, and again, I'm always amazed to see how extraordinarily prescient Guénot was. His book, Crisis of the Modern World, is almost exactly 100 years old now, when a lot has happened since then. The Second World War, the Holocaust, walking on the moon, the tech revolution. It's an unrecognizable world, but it seems that he more or less understood what the problem was. So he talks a lot about climate change, for instance, and how this is going to threaten human survival. Everybody was gung-ho about progress, science, secularity is going to make the world better, but not Guénot, with this idea of the reign of quantity. He recognized that the flattening out of the human horizon, our scurrying after forms of secondary knowledge, and our obsession with the location and the consumption of things necessarily takes us away from our vertical axis, which is where our true serenity and home lies. There's a kind of zero-sum game, and this is present in all traditional spiritualities. But the reason why Islam is particularly suited to Europeans, he says, is because it doesn't require a kind of monastic abnegation. And this takes us right back to the idea of the third replenishment. How does Islam justify itself? By saying, غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ. And the traditional understanding of this is guide us to the middle path, the straight path, the middle path, not that of those who became too preoccupied, according to a certain view, with externals and legislative disputes, nor that of those who went in the opposite direction and ignored the externals and the legislation and became free in the spirit. So the Muslims are to be not monastic, la rahbaniya fil Islam, even though theirs is taken to be the eschatological community when the end times, as traditionally understood, will start to become manifest. The Turba Magna, the Kali Yuga. Guénon in particular was convinced that we're living through that time of spiritual opacity and directionless human greed. So Islam as a middle way, a non-extreme way of dealing with an extreme age, is very attractive to people in this lineage. So looking at some of these existential threats, we can see why the usual demand made of minorities, which is be like us, be like us, be like us. You've got problems, be like us, which is particularly vexing when it comes from people who also claim to like diversity and autonomy and freedom of choice and inclusion. They say those things with one of their forked tongues, but with the others, they're saying, be like us, be like us. Integration means being like us. Accept our views on the body and its desires. Accept our view on gender and what it means or doesn't mean. Accept our view on everything. Be like us. And diversity, multiculturalism, in fact means, well, it's nice when you go to Canary Wharf that you've got a choice of Chinese restaurants or Indian restaurants and it's all really good and we're all foodies, and that's multiculturalism. But that's not really what a believer will be interested in. Those are kind of frothy things on the surface. What we're really interested in, and what Islamic civilization has historically promoted, is a civilization in which genuinely different narratives and meta-narratives can be allowed to continue and coexist. So the question, it's the title of the first chapter in the book, is can liberalism tolerate Islam? Might seem to be paradoxical, but it is a well-known trope. Can liberalism tolerate anything other than itself? That's its contradiction. Or can it only tolerate people who tolerate that which is currently regarded as being tolerable? In which case, is it tolerance at all? So I look a little bit at that and try and unpack it and point to some of the significant difficulties faced, not just by Muslim communities, but by other traditional communities of faith, because much of what I'm saying applies outside the boundary of Islam. If you're interested in the vertical axis and not so much in the horizontal axis, or you want some kind of peaceful balance between the two, well, there's ways of expressing that in Jewish, Christian, other ways as well. But from the Guénonian perspective, it's Islam that does that in a particularly appropriate and age-specific manner. So we have the civilization that says, be like us, be like us, be like us. What is the consequence of its economic model and its view of the material world? Calamitous climate change, disastrous, rising sea levels, extraordinary torrential rain in Australia, floods in Algeria, and the climate change is constantly on its way. Global biodiversity being lost. I don't like to watch David Attenborough any longer because I know that whatever marvels he may show me, the last 5 minutes is going to be something like, and this is the very last white hippopotamus in southern Africa. And you think, oh, great, that's really depressing. The animals are all dying. Such a great civilization that it's killing off just about every species other than ourselves. And if you like animals, I guess like most people, I like animals, that's kind of annoying. In fact, it's outrageous. It's outrageous. And what is the cause of it? Materialism, a stupid model of endless growth, the stupid habit of digging up minerals in one place, making with those minerals something that we use for a little bit, and then throwing the used product in another hole in the ground. And that's the principal activity of human beings in this Anthropocene age, where we've become even a kind of geological accelerant, but not producing beautiful carboniferous things, but just in landfill. That's what we do. We produce landfill full of toxins of various kinds. Not a very appealing advertisement for secularism or consumerism, really. And that's not just a religious argument, it's just common sense. Be like us, they keep saying, be like us. Well, let's look at another of the things that they are now achieving. The population of the world is certainly excessive, it's unbalanced, the mizan has been lost, but it's also unbalanced in all kinds of other, even more threatening ways. Look at Shanna Swan's new book, Countdown. She's a senior American physicist who's talking about fertility rates. Sperm counts in the Western world are down by 60% since 1973. Fact. She says at the current rate of decrease, by 2045, they will be zero. So you guys, I guess, had better hurry up and get married. Talk to your parents after this lecture. So in other words, no babies. It's like Ibn Arabi's strange eschatological vision of there being a last child, khatm al-awlad, after which there's no procreation. What are the reasons for this? Well, of course, they're arguing about it. Is it microplastics? Is it strange toxins? Is it big mobile phones in men's trouser pockets? Is it laptops? Is it new attitudes? The idea of toxic masculinity may well have completely crushed the traditional masculine pride, and that's having a metabolic effect as nobody knows really what maleness means any longer. So maybe the metabolism is adjusting as a result as masculinity diminishes. We really don't know, but the statistics are alarming. But still they say, be like us, be like us, be like us. Interesting, another statistic. You would have thought during the pandemic that there'd be a baby boom. It's fairly obvious. At the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying, by the time this is over, everybody will either be pregnant or look as if they're pregnant. Nothing much to do except that and eating. But in fact, Europe has generally recorded a 30% drop in conceptions and pregnancies during the pandemic. That's strange. In Indonesia, there's an enormous boom, 500,000 more babies than usual. So it seems there's still some things that we Muslims know how to do. Even the government in Indonesia now has vans with tannoys going around the streets telling the men to control themselves because this is becoming a problem. But this is another disparity, which is, of course, going to feed into issues such as climate change migration. The UN is saying by the middle of the century, at least 140 million climate change refugees will be trying to get into Europe. But on top of this, we have more and more population in the Muslim world and some other traditional places, and sterility and a lack of interest in having babies in Europe and other Western countries. So many people, so many women like to be child-free now. That's indicative of a pretty fundamental biological dysfunction, because after all, it's the basic instinct. What does a female want? More than anything, what are her hormones, etc., telling her? You don't need to be too deterministic about this to see that biologically she's likely to want to have a little version of herself. Pretty obvious, and that elemental principle and virtue of motherhood, again, modernity, even some feminists not quite sure what to do with it, and therefore they postpone giving birth till their 30s or even their 40s, more chance of infertility, more chance of birth defects. You do that at your own risk. And as a result, many of them don't. So in Italy, the average woman has 1.3 babies. At the time when thousands of desperate Syrians and Afghans and Iraqis are more or less swimming onto the beaches, crawling up the shores in Italy, young, fit, fertile people, at some point, that's going to make a very significant difference. At the moment, it's looking like a crisis to our Home Secretary and to others. But in the longer term, maybe Europe will go the route of Angela Merkel, with the more sensible understanding that they have an aging population in Germany. 1 million Syrians, young Syrians, active people, would be pretty good for the fertility of the population. That's another thing we have to think about, because this is going to become more and more of a crisis. But still, they'll say, be like us, despite this manifestly unequal world of the rich and infertile haves and the poor but fertile have-nots, which is often the fence that separates what used to be Christendom from what we can perhaps still call Dar al-Islam. There's a lot of stuff to not look forward to there, I think, as things get more tricky. But we also need to talk about questions of identity. I talk about this a bit in the book as well. So what haven't I said about that? Well, not said enough about it. What does it mean now to be a European, really? If increasingly the far right is saying we don't want Muslims because they don't become European, what do they actually mean by that? Does it mean that German Turks should suddenly wear lederhosen and go to the Oktoberfest and sing jolly drinking songs? Is that really what they want? The problem, it seems to me, is that Europe has substantially lost its identity thanks to globalization. They blame the immigrants. The immigrants are not responsible for the decline of Europe's cultures. They don't care about that. It's Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Shanghai. That is what has drained the particularity out of Europe. They find immigrants to be a convenient scapegoat, just as the Jews were a convenient scapegoat for Germans in the 1920s and 1930s, worried about cosmopolitanism and economic issues. And now we are the new Jews, and we seem to be following in those unhappy footsteps. But nonetheless, it's worth thinking about this oddity. Why is it that they aren't really what they used to be? That with every new generation in Europe, there is a substantial loss of particularity. Wander around the English countryside, and you don't need to be Roger Scruton or Peter Hitchens to grumble about this. And you will see a landscape that for centuries was shaped by a particular sensibility, not a particularly arrogant sensibility. It did believe in God, it believed in family, it believed in the things that were familiar and generally were benign. And that shaped the architecture, that shaped people's interiors, and they led kind of simple, not very inspiring lives, going to church and being what they expected to be. Nowadays, that narrative is challenged. Prices of antiques have collapsed. Why? Because everybody's getting rid of their family heirlooms and surrounding themselves with the latest Scandi flat pack stuff from IKEA, and everything is grey. You might have noticed that. There's a loss of colour. Everything now is grey or beige or black or white, which, if you like, the official colours of atheism. Traditional interiors used to be quite jolly. There would be a coloured teapot and there would be wallpaper, and maybe it was a little bit tacky. In fact, it very often was, but at least there was the colour that you associate with people who are optimistic about themselves and the future and want to be cheerful. Places which are still religious, look at Africa, look at India, they're still full of colour. But the West is kind of greying out. There's a symbolism there. So think about Brunel when he built the Great Western Railway 150 years ago, or more, I guess, 170 years ago, perhaps. Every little railway station had to be built with reference to local traditions of architecture and with the local stone. It was understood that that was part of authenticity. You arrived at, I don't know, Ilfracombe or somewhere, and in order to be welcome to Ilfracombe, the station used the local stone to give you a sense of place, because human beings are comforted by the familiar. Talk to anybody who works in an old people's home, and they'll say one of the ways in which you can retain cognitive awareness amongst older people with dementia is by surrounding them with things that they've always been familiar with. Once we're put into a new sterile environment, we tend to lose our sense of self very quickly. But nowadays, a British railway station is going to be the same kind of brushed steel, international style, and it wouldn't occur to anybody to refer to the local because that's not any longer how we think. So local identities in Europe are being lost very quickly, and people hardly notice, or if they do, they think, oh, nostalgia is charming, isn't it? Let's join the National Trust, or some other kind of museumizing of their identity. Now, much of what was lost was certainly not very good. There was a lot of racism, the empire, that story. It is not about idealizing the past, but simply noting that the people who now surround us are people who are increasingly deracinated. That can lead them into radical and undesirable directions. There is a lot of protesting and shifting in an erratic way to the right across Europe now, and also in the United States. In America, overwhelmingly, the principal form of terrorism in the last 5 years has been incel terrorism. Muslims nowhere in sight. Incels have nothing to do with Islam. The big Toronto van murder in 2018 was by an incel. So things are changing fast, and this sense that we don't know who we are, we don't know what we belong to, the familiar family furniture is no longer around us as we die. We've got no idea what our grandchildren's lifestyle will be. Everything is liquid modernity, as Zygmunt Bauman calls it, because capitalism likes people to change things quickly because you make more money when people are dissatisfied with what they have. A piece of furniture that stays in the family for 300 years is a catastrophe for capitalism or for advertising or for the big sources of energy in our culture. It's useless. So everything gets churned over, put in the liquidizer of modernity, and people end up not really having a sense of self. They've lost their story. They no longer quite know what to do with their history. We now even have hoarding around the statue of Winston Churchill, which shows the extent to which these new inner turbulences and the new forms of reparation for the sins of people long ago has gone. Who would have expected that? One of my first memories was going to the lying in state of Winston Churchill, which must have been when I was 4. I still remember it. A big national thing because he was the Blitz and had saved us from the Nazis, etc. For all his faults, and we always know all politicians always have faults, all human beings always have faults. But back then, the idea that one day his statue might have to be protected from graffiti artists or from those who hate his narrative would have seemed inconceivable and a sign of loss and of decadence. So whatever our position on these things might be, we recognize that people are losing their narratives and their sense of self. They're even losing their sense of what exactly gender might mean. You can choose it for yourself. Don't essentialize. Some of our maternity hospitals, like Brighton, for instance, no longer are called maternity hospitals, they are perinatal. Basic traditional assumptions about what manhood was, what womanhood was, are now being interrogated and challenged, demonized. And again, it's not that the past was ideal. My point is simply that people are losing their coordinates. And this, I think, is something that may well lead them into lurching into paroxysms of chauvinism and generalized loss of a center or a sense of reason. So we are in this modernity that on the one hand says, be like us. And all of these state agencies across Europe are about integration, which basically means making Muslims like everybody else, with perhaps a few sort of exotic Eid festivals, or we can go on Hajj and that kind of thing. But basically, we're supposed to be underneath like everybody else. But on the other hand, their story seems to be the destruction of the planet. That's quite severe. The end of human fertility, that's pretty severe. Never mind things like artificial intelligence and other possible existential threats, and the loss of their own identity. the abolition of the past. I think maybe they'll get rid of the hereditary peers in the House of Lords because they no longer have a sense that they are there so that the past can have a vote. They don't understand that principle any longer. It's just beyond their horizon. So it makes it quite difficult for us, but it is a vindication of Guénon's insistence that Islam is the religion for modern Europe if you really want to maintain that vertical dimension. And it's hard. The religion itself has very significant obligations. Ramadan is not terribly easy, is it? 5 daily prayers, Fajr and so forth, that's quite a discipline compared to what's expected of people in other world religions. There's a cat can hit you where it hurts, etc. It's not an easy option. But nonetheless, those practices are immutable and unlikely to be changed anytime soon. So in the midst of this endless swirl of changing narratives and the threat to the most fundamental constituents of human continuity and sense of self, you have Hablullah al-Mateen, God's firm rope, and Urwatul Wuthqa, the firmest handhold. We have the Sunnah, and we have the basic practices of the religion. And we should be saying that's enough. وَكَفَى بِهَا نِعْمَةً, and not really grumbling too much about what's going on, because what's going on is just what happens when the nafs is in control and people no longer have access to ruh. You have imbalance, you have turbulence, you have unhappiness, you have mass Prozac consumption. That's just what's going to happen, and there's nothing surprising in that. But the identity is, of course, that we belong everywhere, and we are probably closer to the way people used to be in France, Germany, Denmark, Norway, England, than the people who live there now are, because we still have the vertical dimension, a sense of the importance of family. We care for our elderly at home. We pray. We do those things that used to be constitutive of European culture, but have now been thrown out with the bathwater and are almost unimaginable to so many people who generally don't ever see their cousins, or they're just not part of that traditional world. So that kind of is the place I'd like to finish with this provocative statement that whereas the Islamophobes say that Muslims, migrants, etc., obviously don't belong because they're from the other side of that wall which we erected in the Middle Ages to keep the Saracens out. They're the last people we want. But instead, the perspective, which I think is the perspective of heaven, is that the Muslims are to be a leaven in the dough, shuhada'a ala nas, witnesses to mankind, وَيَكُونُ رَسُولُ عَلَيْكُمْ شَهِيدًا, and the Holy Prophet a witness to us. We emulate him, and therefore we become exemplary representatives of a traditional, balanced, normal humanity. غَيْرُ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ. And then, inshallah, people's hearts will melt and we will be perceived as witnesses and therapists rather than as just a problem of compliance, which seems to be the best that people can come up with at the moment. So probably that was a bit longer than I'd thought of speaking, and I've covered a hopelessly wide range of topics. But inshallah, I will hold my peace now and hand over.